So we're 2 years into the pandemic now, and we've got a much better idea of what COVID-19 is and the impact that it has had on the world's populations. And it has sadly taken many lives. Unfortunately, there are some lies around the pandemic that are still festering about, and I actually saw a video from someone claiming that the number of COVID-19 deaths has been overestimated by about 10 times, but sadly they were wrong. Very, very wrong. If you came here for a conspiracy theory, I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you. We talk straight facts on this channel. And this is a grim subject, but I'll try and keep it interesting with some graphics. So first, let's zoom in on what actually happens when someone dies of COVID. And then we'll take a step back and look at how each death is counted. So when a patient passes away, a doctor fills in a document called the Medical Certificate of the Cause of Death, an MCCD. And this is a legal document, similar to a birth certificate or a wedding certificate, so it must be factual. And this is not something that involves guesswork or suspicion. The details entered on this are facts. And if a doctor isn't quite sure what caused the person's death, they must refer this to the coroner, who is a specialised doctor in performing post-mortem examinations and determining the cause of death. The death certificate has information that you'd expect, like the name of the person, the date of death, and also the name of the doctor completing the certificate. It also asks when the doctor filling in the form last saw the patient alive. And here in the next section it asks whether a post-mortem is required. And again, this would be needed if there was uncertainty about the cause of death. And this section is to confirm that someone has actually seen the patient after death to confirm that this has occurred. Now let's focus on the part of the certificate relating to the cause of death. Part 1A is the immediate cause of death, followed by any underlying causes that may have led to this. Part 2 relates to the patient's other medical conditions that may have contributed to the death. Let's go through some examples to show you the difference between these sections. I'll then explain how this relates to putting COVID-19 on a death certificate. If a patient dies of a heart attack, for example, then the immediate cause of death would be this, a myocardial infarction. That's just the medical word for a heart attack. Sometimes this doesn't necessarily have any underlying trigger, as this could just be an unexpected event. And if this was with someone who was previously thought to be fit and well, this may be the only cause on the certificate. However, let's look at another example. If, for example, a patient dies of a stroke, which is a cerebrovascular accident, this would be 1A, but this may have an underlying cause, which could be atrial fibrillation, which is a condition where the heart beats irregularly and can result in the development of a blood clot, which could then pass to the brain and cause a stroke. The patient may also have a background of other medical conditions, such as ischemic heart disease. So although their heart didn't cause the death itself, it's relevant to their underlying health. Now let's look at someone who may have died from COVID-19. So they could have this written in the death certificate under 1A, because COVID-19 is a cause of death in itself. However, depending on the patient's condition, this may also be written as pneumonia under 1A, but with COVID-19 as 1B, for example, or perhaps even acute respiratory distress syndrome as 1A, but with COVID as 1B, because COVID was the cause of the ARDS or pneumonia. For someone with a background of type 2 diabetes and ischemic heart disease, it would also be relevant to include these under section 2 of the death certificate, as these are significant health conditions. They died from COVID-19, but they had a background of these conditions as well. Now let's compare this to a different patient, where they happened to have COVID-19, but this was not the cause of death. For example, if they had metastatic breast cancer, this could be put down as 1A. However, it would still be relevant to put COVID-19 under section 2 if they had tested positive for this prior to their death, as this may have affected the patient and contributed to their death somewhat, although it likely wasn't the immediate cause of death. So those are some scenarios of how COVID-19 might appear on the death certificate. But let's now take a step back and look at this on a population level to view the statistics for England as a whole. And I'll try and keep this simple, as I know that statistics can get complicated. At present, the government publishes a few different death statistics relating to COVID-19. One of these is the number of people who died with COVID-19 mentioned on the death certificate. And at this point, I want to make it clear that one figure that has been incorrectly quoted by people online, who have no statistical background I might add, is that only 17,000 people died from COVID-19 so far. But this is not true, and this figure has been misrepresented, and taken from the number of death certificates that only stated COVID-19 with nothing else. However, as I've explained, it is common to have underlying conditions such as diabetes under section 2 of the death certificate. But that does not mean that the diabetes caused death, rather that it was an underlying background condition. So people who had COVID-19 and a background of diabetes still died from COVID. And if we look at all of the death certificates with COVID-19 mentioned, this gives a total of 177,000 deaths so far. And we know from the Office of National Statistics that for at least 140,000 of these deaths, COVID-19 was the underlying cause of death, as opposed to one of these pre-existing conditions that may have also been listed on the death certificate. Now let's look at a different way of reporting the number of deaths. The most commonly quoted figure in the news is for the number of people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID test. Now, there are also some drawbacks with this method, because at the very start of the pandemic, when tests were not widely available, this would have missed cases in March and April 2020. More recently, this balance may have shifted as the Omicron variant is more infectious but slightly less deadly. And this is partly because of the heightened levels of immunity in the UK population from the vaccinations, but also from the fact that the variant itself is slightly less likely to kill. This means that this current statistic might start to overestimate deaths at some point, as people could have COVID but die from something else, like a car accident, for example. You might question why this statistic is used when some of these patients may not have actually died from COVID. And while that is true, one argument is that it is better to capture more deaths than miss out on them altogether, and a line has to be drawn somewhere. So 28 days was chosen as an arbitrary period. But what's more important is the trend, because this allows us to identify the spread of COVID and the rate of death associated with this in general. A third way of counting the number of COVID deaths is by looking at the number of excess deaths. And this works by looking at the number of deaths from all causes during a period of time, beyond what we would usually expect to see in normal conditions. In this case, we're interested in how the number of deaths during the COVID-19 pandemic compares to deaths we would have expected had the pandemic not occurred. And this is therefore a better measure of the total impact of the pandemic on deaths than the confirmed COVID deaths alone, because it captures not just the confirmed COVID deaths, but also deaths that were missed and deaths from other causes that are attributable to the overall pandemic. So the question then becomes, which of these statistics is the most accurate? And the answer is usually to use a combination of these. So the range of deaths from COVID-19 in the UK so far, as of today, is about 120 to 170,000 people, but it's certainly not just 17,000 deaths. And to claim it is such a low figure would be disrespectful to all of the people who sadly died from COVID. Phew, that got pretty intense. But I hope you found this video interesting, and if you did, feel free to share it with others, and hit the like button below, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, you can also hit the subscribe button. Before you go, you might want to check out this video that I made on how to tell the difference between a cough and COVID, or maybe this video on how to do a COVID lateral flow test. And I guess I'll see you next time. See ya!